introduce CJ, who's an assistant professor in the Department of Mexican American and Latino Studies. Before he received his doctorate in history at the University of Chicago, he studied the history of art and architecture at Harvard University and art history at Stanford University. He writes and teaches about the history of the US-Mexico border and environmental history. His first book, Borderland, Border Water, A History of Construction on the US-Mexico Divide, is a history of the built world of the US-Mexico borderline. And this book received the Vernacular Architecture Forum's Abbott Lowell Cummings Award. So congratulations, CJ. His current book project is about the history of the Chihuahuan Desert, the largest and least known expanse of dry land in North America. This study is an effort to redefine border history, explain what it means to be a desert dweller, and consider the political implications of life in an exceptionally harsh ecoregion. Last year, this work was supported by an Andrew W. Mellon Fellowship at the School of Advanced Research in Santa Fe, New Mexico. So before I ask CJ to open, I just want to thank Courtney Mador, as always, for her peerless work behind the scenes to coordinate with speakers, publicize events, and take care of the Zoom logistics. As Courtney has indicated here on this slide that's up, if you'd like to ask a question, you can post your question in chat while CJ is speaking. And if you would, please indicate if you'd like to ask the question yourself. It will be very easy for us to do that on this Zoom meeting. So CJ, let me hand it over to you.
All right, thank you so much, Miriam, and to Courtney, who, as we all know, is just an endless font of enthusiasm and helpful connective tissue between us and each other. There's so many people in the history department that I want to thank and who have been directly responsible and helpful in bringing this book project to fruition and supporting the project, but also just my presence here at UT Austin as a historian, but not in the history department. And I see some old students in the room, and I see some graduate students. I see some very, very old friends in the room from back home where I come from in New Mexico. And so it just is the Benson, people in the Benson here. There's Daniel. And so it's just an absolute pleasure and an honor. There's very few places that I would be more excited to present this work for those of you who are not familiar with it than here in the IHS and the history department. So thank you very much for the invitation. And I'm more than happy to stick around after 4. We'll go as long as you want to go in terms of the Q&A. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you a little bit about the story that I tell in the book. I'm going to talk a little bit about the story or the research and writing of the book, which took some false starts and hit some dead ends, but ultimately I think came out all right. I want to speak briefly about the arguments and the sources I use, particularly visual sources. I want to say a few words about the challenge of representation of the U.S.-Mexico border that I faced, and I think is a larger challenge within border history. And I want to conclude really briefly with a brief introduction to my future or my current work, but what will be a future book about the Chihuahuan Desert. So let me share my screen here. All right. So the story of the book, the most basic premise is simply to say that there is a particular kind of construction project that is greatly overexposed on the US-Mexico divide, and that is the fence. The fence is highly photogenic, intentionally so. It's a mega project by any standard. It's been going for most of my students' lives, which creates a real challenge as I teach border history to develop their sense of historical imagination before that tactical infrastructure took hold of the line and of our imaginations and what we think of as possible or not possible on the border. But this is just a small fraction of a much larger network of construction projects on the international divide. And so the one line synopsis of this book is a tracing of every major construction project that unfolded on the US-Mexico divide for the past 172 years. And it's not meant to be comprehensive. It's not meant to be every single construction project on the border, but it's meant to give a sense of this transition and this story of accretion that went from relatively nothing on the place that would become the US-Mexico border up to this site of multiple mega projects, the fence and fencing systems included. So it started very slowly in the 1850s and 1890s in the context of survey markers, only on the land border, not on the river border, which we have here in Texas. So this is one of those between the Mexican state of Sonora and the US state of Arizona. And these obelisks are the exact, were placed at the exact spot of the border. So the tip of the obelisk, can you see my pointer?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Yeah, so the tip of the obelisk is the precise location of the border. And so the obelisk, the survey marker is half in one country, half in the other. And then after these obelisks, or the earlier iteration of these obelisks were set up in place in the 1850s, about 3 generations went by before any large scale construction started to take place. That next, or the first real iteration of large scale construction begins after the Mexican Revolution / the Great War, when we see 2 simultaneous developments, both of which had tremendous implications for the border. The rise of a border patrolling state in a very different way, which many of you are already familiar with, the rise of the US-Mexico Border Patrol, and just a different sense of nationalism in the US that came after the end of World War I. And less obvious, perhaps, although Erica's not here today, but she could tell you all about it, the rise of reinforced concrete and the ability to create large-scale hydraulic engineering projects. And because the border is mostly a water border, which people forget, or people don't fully recognize, I don't think, both of those political developments, but also these environmental manipulation developments, both play out in very interesting ways on both borderland and border water. So to give you a sense of what that looks like from the point of view of construction, here's an early Border Patrol tower from the 1930s. So this was the primitive first iteration of what we have now, the massive surveillance system. Now we have extraterrestrial satellites, we have radar, we have footfall sensors, we have all the high-tech stuff, but it's basically just an expansion of this basic concept, which is how do you create through some kind of human technology a force multiplier? How do you extend the ability of the human eye to surveil a large landscape and therefore gain some kind of tactical control? This is, of course, coming from the point of view of police themselves. I include this this image not just as a representation of that early kind of police infrastructure on the border that we see, but also as an aside, and I'm speaking really specifically to the grad students here and maybe sometimes to the undergrads too, or to some extent to the undergrads. So when I first came across this photograph in the National Archives in DC, my first inclination, which was a bad inclination, was to crop it. Because I was still stuck in this art historical mindset where I was interested more in composition than I was in what these documents can tell us as historical sources. And so I came this close to cropping this telephone pole out. And that would have been a big mistake, because part of what's interesting about this photograph is not just to say, here is an example of an early Border Patrol tower, but to say, this is an example of how a visual archival record was used as another form of documentation for the specifics and banality of construction. And so we actually see written on the photograph with a ballpoint pen the exact specifications for the angle iron and the concrete, but then also very, very importantly, the connectivity. So how do you actually communicate what you saw or didn't see from the top of this tower to someone else on the ground? And so part of what it means still to have a tactical infrastructure oriented toward policing has to do with not only this physical construction, but also the ability to communicate and span long distances through that built environment, even in the less dramatic kinds of the built environment that has to do with communication lines. So switching gears now to the context of hydraulic engineering after World War I and also eventually World War II, we see here the cofferdams interrupting the international border here. This is between Texas and Mexico. This is the cofferdams building Amistad Dam, which some of you might know from personal experience out between Del Rio and Acuña. And so we can see here a level of hydraulic engineering that was not possible in the 19th century, certainly fantasized about, but not possible. And there's a huge literature, as you all know, about hydraulic engineering in the West. There's also a Mexican version of that about hydraulic engineering in the north, in the arid north of Mexico. But part of what I tried to do in the book is insert the border dams into that larger conversation. And I'll talk in a few minutes about what becomes really interesting when you think about hydraulic engineering projects and policing building projects in conversation with one another. Whereas in many cases, there seems kind of separate historiographies. So this history of accretion, and I'm not trying to sum it all up here in this initial introduction here, but this history of accretion that involves all kinds of projects, from starting with those initial survey markers to more and more dams on the International Divide, more and more dams off the International Divide, but on rivers that pertain to the International Divide, channelization of those rivers, the straightening of those rivers, and a variety of other projects I'll talk about in a few minutes, all begin to build and build and build until we get, and starting in the 1990s, really, and up until the present day, this very overbuilt border that we have today. And like I said, I'm not going to talk about the fence because we've all had enough of it. But what I want to point out, and I talk about this in the last chapter of the book, and this I think is something that's often overlooked, is that if we think about the 1990s on as a time period in which we see dramatic expansion of police infrastructure building, we also have to remember that that was only one of two mega projects that was under construction on the US-Mexico border since the 1990s. The other one, of course, being the highway systems that connected the United States and Mexico, and of course Canada, in the context of the Free Trade Agreement in 1994. And so in the same period when the very high profile photogenic police infrastructure is going up on the border and kept going up on the border past 9/11 and up until the previous presidential administration, although that was mostly a bunch of weird add-ons we could talk about if you want. New highways were being built, old highways were being hardened and expanded, new ports of entry were being built, a lot of new bridges were being built over the river between Texas and Coahuila and Tamaulipas and Nuevo León, and ports of entry were being expanded. And these are not the same kind of, they don't have the same kind of photogenic quality. And I think that there's something very, very easy to overlook about transportation infrastructure. But the story of the contemporary border is at least as much about this history of asphalt and connective tissue as it is about barriers and fences and surveillance. So I want to switch gears now and talk a little bit about the story of research and writing this book. This is intentionally blank, by the way, don't worry. I made a false start, and the false start came out of my dissertation. I assumed when I first started writing about the border, or really researching the border in graduate school, that the correct story to tell about the international divide was about policing. And at the time, Kelly Leidler Hernandez's book and Rachel St. John's book had not come out yet. And so, so in many ways, they kind of did the work I'd hoped to do by focusing largely on policing organizations. But I came to see the border not as not a police zone, because it most certainly is one of the most dramatic and unique police zones in American history and Mexican history as well. But I came to see, from my point of view, border history as more about multiple agencies and their interactions and the connections between the built environment and the natural environment, more than a story that I felt like I could or should tell through a single agency like the Border Patrol. And I will tell you this, and I never thought I would hear myself say what I'm about to say, and that is, a lot of this recognition and realization came from the fact that I moved to Texas. Texas is, we all know, a shining example of an infrastructure state. And I don't mean that necessarily I don't mean that as a compliment. And we all, well, those of us who are here in Texas know, got a real crash course in what the infrastructure of Texas is or isn't during the deep freeze and the disaster of a couple of weeks ago. And it was exactly this heavily but not obviously built out dimension of Texas, both in terms of transportation and the history of the farm to market, ranch to market road system here, in terms of the energy infrastructure, which now we're all too familiar with. And then, of course, the ports of entry that prompted me to think, and of course, the two cross-border dams that prompted me to think a bit more deeply about what the U.S.-Mexico border was in the aggregate and how to tell that story in a more holistic way than I had seen in the literature. And part of the way I did this is another Texas connection, was by working in depth with the International Boundary and Water Commission archives in the National Archives branch in Fort Worth. And there I unearthed these boxes in the archives that were unopened by researchers. They had come as they were boxed by the IBWC in El Paso to the Fort Worth branch. And I opened them up, and out spilled hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of blueprints and maps and construction documents, both from the IBWC itself and the Army Corps of Engineers, that gave me a visual record of construction on the border that made me think I could make a contribution to Borderlands historiography from a multi-agency and environmental and a visual point of view. So I reframed the project largely here at UT, and again with a lot of support and friendship and terrific feedback and mentorship from many of you here in the history department. So my appreciation is just ongoing. Let me switch gears now and talk about the arguments and the key concepts of the book. The basic argument is the border is a construction site. And part of what I'm saying here is a way of expanding the notion that concepts of race and concepts of citizenship and belonging and sovereignty are themselves socially constructed. And that is most certainly the case. But what I'm pointing out is that the history of accretion on the US-Mexico border lends a concrete manifestation to these socially constructed categories. So the border is a construction site. One of the key concepts, and the reason the title is the title, is I want to say something very simple and almost deceptively simple, and that is that land and water are different. They're distinct things. And building projects unfolded in very distinct ways on the river border versus the western land border. And we can talk more about that if you want. But by breaking that up and thinking about the US-Mexico border as first and foremost a water border, an arciphoneous frontier, at least part of it here in Texas, and a land border made it easier for me, at least, to start thinking in this more holistic way about how these different agencies were interacting and why we see the differences that we do here in Texas and in the western states. For instance, there's far more miles of the border fence built in the public land states than there are here in Texas, even though Texas historically is always complaining and crying about why there's not more policing in the Texas ultimate law and order state. And part of what I'm doing in the title, emphasizing the difference between border land and border water, is to push back a little bit on the borderlands concept. And I'm certainly aware and think of myself as part of this long tradition going back now over 100 years of borderland scholarship. But I wanted to emphasize but by specifying land versus water, or land and water, I should say, I wanted to jog readers out of that easy generalization that we often have about kind of anything that has to do with immigration or border processes we head under borderlands. And part of what I got out of this separation between land and water is a new appreciation, or an appreciation for the first time, about the extent to which the various building projects on the land and various building projects on the water were in fact connected in surprising ways. And so if you think about police infrastructure as existing to control the movement of people and goods in one way or another, to either stop them from coming or to facilitate how they come, and where we can think about hydraulic engineering projects as nothing short of trying to control nature. And those two inclinations toward control of one way or another became bedfellows on the US-Mexico border in ways they did not in the history of policing more generally in American or Mexican societies, or the history of hydraulic engineering in either Mexico and the United States. And that's what I found really interesting. Part of the reason for that is water is, especially water running through the desert, is notoriously difficult to control. This is an image from a 1902 series of topographic maps documenting the first big survey of the US-Mexico border. This is the mouth of the Colorado River. So you can see here, this is California, Arizona, this is Sonora, and this is Baja California. And this is what we call a meander map. So part of this map was drawn by the Mexican survey team. Part of the map was drawn by the American survey team. They both got different results because they surveyed it a year apart. And so they decided to just merge them together to recognize the extent to which this river ran in various directions as it reached the delta and its drainage into the Sea of California. And that's all well and good in the 19th century, when the precision when the precision of international borders mattered a little bit less. But as we move into the 20th and certainly the 21st century, we find that the preeminent expectation of international borders is that they be precise and immovable. And so from that perspective, you would be hard pressed to pick a worse proxy for that international border than rivers that move. This is just a 21-mile section of the lower Colorado, but then of course, the Rio Grande runs for hundreds and hundreds of miles, and became a much more difficult thing to wrangle. In contrast, when you're drawing a border over land, you can ignore the physical environment through which it passes. So this is another map from that series. Some of you will recognize this is El Paso, Texas. This is Ciudad Juarez, Chihuahua. This is New Mexico. And this is the international border just drawn straight across. These are contour lines in the topographic map that show change in elevation, but that doesn't matter for the international border. It just shoots right across as if this mountain, which we call Cristo Rey, wasn't even there until it reaches the river, at which point the river becomes the international border and all hell breaks loose for over 100 years. Part of the challenge of that took place in El Paso. This is El Paso, Texas, Ciudad Juarez, Chihuahua. And what you're looking at here is an urban plan that is documenting the re-channeled river that during which this land was ceded back to Mexico. And this is a long story of the Chamizal that some of you know, some of you might not. The point that I want to make here is to emphasize how closely the urban plans of both the US and Mexican cities are here, right at the point where the river becomes the international border. And I use this slide to illustrate a point that I made a little bit earlier about when you start looking at both policing and hydraulic engineering at the same time, you start to see things you wouldn't have otherwise seen and connections between them that you would not have otherwise noticed. And so this is one of my favorite maps for a variety of reasons, but one of them is when this land here was ceded back to Mexico, there were all kinds of people's houses that were already there and some businesses, including this packing plant, a sawmill that some of you who know northern Mexican history and know the timber history in the Sierra Tarahumara. This is where they took all that timber to cut down. But there was also a US Border Patrol station that was ceded over to the Mexican side as they moved the river in the 1960s. And the Mexicans knocked down everything in this, kind of started from scratch. There's a park there and one of the universities is there, but they kept this US Border Patrol station, and they transformed it into the headquarters of the SILA, the Mexican counterpart to the International Boundary and Water Commission. And so the policing structure was then repurposed to basically manage the boundary from the Mexican side, in this case, mostly water. And I love that detail. So let me talk now about sources. I used a lot of archives. I used a lot of oral histories from the UTEP Oral History Institute. But I think most importantly to me, I used visual sources, a range of visual sources. And so I want to walk you through some examples of that and what I got out of them and why I chose them to be included in the book. So this is a photograph from the Smithers collection at the Ransom Center, which is an absolutely astonishing collection of border photographs largely from the 1910s, so during the Revolution, taken by this photographer who was a teamster back in the 1910s, and this is out in the mountains of West Texas. And these are pack trains that are moving various supplies for the true U.S. militarization of the border during the Mexican Revolution, but especially in 1916, 1917. And the way I use these photographs is to understand and highlight for readers the importance of roads. Again, another really unsung and unrecognized part of what border history is and what the capacity of policing is. I think you could argue that if you want to measure policing capacity, you wouldn't count the number of guns that they have. You would count the miles of remote roads that they have. In other words, the extent to which they can access very remote territory. And that's always been the dream, I think, of border policing is to achieve territorial coverage, to surveil and guard. And we see the first inkling of this in the 1910s during the Revolution. We also see another very common form of photography. This is from the 1930s. This is an aerial oblique. They took the International Boundary and Water Commission took a lot of photographs from the air, oblique angle photographs from the air. So you can actually get a sense of the topography. They took also a lot of vertical angle, but you have to kind of piece those together like a puzzle to figure out what's going on. Oblique angle photographs are much easier to work with. And the reason they took this photograph, which is of Columbus, New Mexico. The Mexicans know that's where Pancho Villa attacked the United States in 1916. This is Palomas, Chihuahua. This is the railroad. This is the international border. It's out there, and it's wherever you want it to be, pretty much at that point. And the reason they took this photograph is as part of a plan to build the first large-scale border fence that stretched over 200 miles and that was mainly constructed in the late 1940s. And here's an excerpt, or here's a detail, I should say, from that early border fence. And this is the photograph I took of this map that came out accordion style from the IBWC files in Fort Worth. And I checked and I double checked and I triple checked the other folks who've written about early border fences and realized that people didn't know this border fence was there. And it was by far the longest of its kind. And there are a lot of very interesting features of this that we can talk about, but I think it's important very briefly to point out that even though this fence was the first long distance fence over 250 miles, the vast majority of that is what they're calling ranch type fences, which is barbed wire. And this was built in the context of a foot and mouth disease outbreak in central Mexico in 1947, among other things. But it was a very purpose-built fence, as opposed to a theatrical and politically motivated fence that fencing along the border has become, certainly since the Secure Fence Act in 2006. And then another oblique angle photograph of Falcon Dam, which some of you know from South Texas. It was built in 54, completed in 54. It's an earth and fill dam. It's half in Mexico, half in Mexico, half in the United States, completed by a crew of Mexican workers, American workers, Mexican engineers, American engineers. And one of the most interesting things to me about looking at these hydraulic engineering projects is the extent to which they reveal an ambiguity about border history that is often cast as an open and shut case of moral failing or aggression. And certainly there were towns of people, villages in both Tamaulipas and in Texas who were displaced, forcibly moved to make way for the reservoir. And I can't imagine anything, to me, that kind of those kinds of stories get me every time. By the same token, this construction of this dam afforded flood protection to people downstream, which is still imperfect, but nonetheless. And so you find these stories of projects that create great pain, but they also provide benefits. In some cases limited, but benefits nonetheless, of people on both sides of the line. And of course, once again, the deeper I looked into all of this, the more evidence I found of connections between hydraulic engineering and police building. So when I looked at the plat map, which you can see a detail here of the new town called Zapata that was displaced due to the reservoir, what I found, and you can see it here in the lower right-hand corner, if our faces aren't in front of it, this red circled lot in the newly constructed town of Zapata, that is where the Border Patrol barracks were designated. So that's where the Border Patrol lived. And so in the reconstruction of this displaced town, border policing housing infrastructure was built into the plan. And so you can't take them apart. If you look at a hydraulic project, you're going to find policing. If you look at policing at least on the water border, you're going to find some water component. So I want to speak really briefly now about the problem of representation of the border. It is the representation of the border poses a very particular representational challenge, because it is a place that is simultaneously very overexposed. Everybody talks about it, everybody's got an opinion about it. We see certain pictures of it, usually of the fence, all the time, certainly over the last 4 years, but it is also a very unfamiliar space. The vast majority of Americans have never been there. The vast majority of Mexicans have never been there. And even people who have been there have typically been to one place, and it's 2,000 miles long, and there's I think 48 official ports of entry. So so this creates a representational problem. And as you've noticed from the images I've shown you, and if you've seen my book, you see that that a lot of the 53 images I include, the vast majority of them are from above. They are God's eye view of the border, a view of the border that is that pertains oftentimes to either corporations or governments. And so I've tried to discuss that as much as I can in the context in which these photos were produced. But speaking of the border in the aggregate also poses a representational problem. This is the political map of the border that we've all seen, of the 4 border states in the US, the 6 border states in Mexico, the main border towns. And I find this representation of the border to be not just unhelpful, but actually actively harmful in terms of understanding the complexity of what the international divide is. And so what I did as I was preparing the manuscript is I kept a running list of every place name, not just political designation, but also mountain range, river infrastructure project, ecosystem that I mentioned in the entire manuscript. And I went to my brilliant map maker, Josh Conrad, at the School of Architecture. And I said, Josh, can you fit all these onto a single map? And he said, I'll try. And he did. And this is the map he created. And this is the frontispiece of the book. And this, to me, every time I look at it, I breathe a big sigh of relief, because I look at this and I see the border the way I have learned to see it, and as a very complex constellation of political developments, built environment, and natural environments. And that's a story I tried to tell in the book. And part of this project, delving deeply into the question of what is the relationship between the built environment and the natural environment, led me to dream up my second book project, which I've been working on now for the past couple of years. And And the premise of that book is to rethink border history from an environmental perspective. And by that, I mean, instead of starting the historical analysis, bounding the historical analysis through political designations, states, international divides, and that sort of thing, I want to begin with environmental boundaries, the edges of the Chihuahuan Desert. Start from that premise that occupies huge swaths of two major states in Mexico and two major states in the United States, and try to tell a history from the point of view of the desert, in which we think about political designations as not irrelevant, but as only one of several components of how to tell border history. So thank you very much for listening. We've got some time and I'm all ears. So thanks again for the invitation. And I really look forward to hearing what you all have to say and what you're curious about.
Thank you, CJ, for that really enlightening exposition of the perspectives, the different perspectives that one can take on a border that most people really take for granted on the map. I don't see any hands or questions. Please put a question in the chat if you have one, or raise your hand. And meanwhile, I'm going to ask CJ a question that I have, and this is by no means, this is not near my own field, but what strikes me, you said very early on, you talked about the overbuilt border we have today. And I wonder if you could compare, in terms of the overbuilt border, you could compare this with other borders, make some kind of comparison. I was a little bit surprised by that.
By calling it overbuilt?
Thinking comparatively. I was thinking comparatively myself about other borders.
Yeah, I think back to this terrific conversation I had with David Fitzgerald when he came here for one of the IHS conferences a couple of years ago. We were talking afterward. Of course, he was a UT undergrad before he started writing about, U.S. or Mexican immigration policy, and I said, "Really? Are you from Texas?" And he said, "Well, kind of. I actually grew up in the Gaza Strip." And I said, "Really? That I didn't see that coming." And he talked to me about how part of the premise for his writing about U.S.-Mexico immigration relations and that sort of thing was the fact that he was very disoriented when he made Mexican friends, and in college he started traveling back and forth to Monterrey, and was acquainted with this like militarization discourse that we have in the United States of the U.S.-Mexico border. He's like, "There's no tank traps. This is nothing, right? In comparison with really heavily militarized borders, or in many cases, like we know in South Asia, nuclear powers, who are engaged in a real standoff with one another." And so I think that it's a big mistake to think about the U.S.-Mexico border as exclusively antagonistic. The transportation and trade infrastructure makes the exact opposite argument. However fraught the relationship is, the United States and Mexico are not two countries that are set to go to war with one another. And even during the Mexican Revolution, despite the concerns of some reactionaries, that really never seemed to be the case. And so, I always like talking to people from other parts of the world and hearing their stories, because I'm not an expert on other borders, but people who know the DMZ, people who know the India-Pakistan border, people who know Middle Eastern borders, oftentimes see the border between our two countries as differently than we see it in the U.S. and in Mexico. And so I think that, I get asked the comparative question a lot, and that's kind of my stock answer. My deeper, more personal answer is, part of what I try to do in my work, and certainly in my teaching, and my students in the room can hopefully attest to this, is try to advance an argument that thinks about the specific places that through which an international border happened to be drawn. And in that regard, taking borders as the unit of comparison becomes less possible if we're looking at specific places like the Chihuahuan Desert, like the Sonoran Desert, like the Tamaulipan Scrub, and so on and so forth. So I hope that's not too much of a evasion, but.
Thank you. No, I appreciate that. Who would like to ask a question here? Surely there is a question. I don't want to ask another one because I don't want to be greedy.
Oh, Michael's got one.
Oh, Michael, I don't see you here. Michael.
I didn't use the chat. My question is kind of it's not a follow-up, but it's parallel to Marion's. The water manipulations that you describe on the border have their, they have their specific border dimensions, but as you said, they also fit into literature of water control in the West and a sort of impulse to not tolerate any water going its own way. Anyway, I wonder what you have to say about the differences between water control on the border and elsewhere, just farther up the Colorado or the Rio Grande.
Well, I think the first point that I would make is that there's, and this is part of what I'm getting at in the desert project, but like if you take, for instance, Elephant Butte Dam in central New Mexico, and you compare it with Boquillas Dam on the Rio Conchos in Chihuahua, you find they were both built really early in the 19 teens. You find they were both built by American engineers. I mean, it was part of a mirror image of desert water irrigation control in the 19 teens. And so the fact that one was in Mexico and one's in the United States, from an engineering point of view and from a development point of view, mattered less than that they were both in the desert. So it's important to point out that there are these similarities between, for lack of a better term, the American West and the Mexican North, both environmentally, but also I would argue culturally. So the difference then becomes in part the agencies. So the Army Corps of Engineers and the Bureau of Reclamation are the main agencies in the interior of the United States, and then Recursos Hidráulicos and then and later CONAGUA become the big construction agencies on the Mexican side. And these are managed by the respective like departments of interior, like internal cabinet level bureaucracies. But if you're going to build something on the US-Mexico border, you have to do it through either the SILA or the IBWC on the US side. And they're using engineers from the same kinds of places. But those agencies have diplomatic status, not just engineering status or whatever in the United States. And that there are implications for that in terms of how you build a project that's like half and half, using Mexican engineers and American engineers, how you have to produce your documentation. All the official correspondence between the two agencies has to be bilingual. That's of course not an issue in Mexico or in the United States, when everything's either in English or Spanish. And then of course, oftentimes you're working with even more agencies than you otherwise would be, specifically the Border Patrol. And so I think from a functional engineering point of view, there isn't a difference. From an agency bureaucratic point of view, there are some big differences.
Okay, we have a question from Connie. I don't want to pronounce your last name incorrectly, so I will let you tell us who you are. Would you like to ask your question, Connie?
Okay. Yeah, there. Connie Haham. And I was just wondering about the status of dams on the border, because all over the country, they're getting old, in bad condition, And if they aren't being eliminated, there is talk of them being eliminated. If that were happening on the Mexican border, I suppose it would change a lot of things.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of really interesting things that question brings up. As far as I know, Amistad and Falcon, the two big storage dams, are in decent condition. What I've been writing about with in the desert manuscript are these arroyo dams that people don't really think of because there's not water behind them for like 99.9% of the time. And you see these in southern New Mexico and in El Paso. And I'll talk about this actually, the oil and water panel that we have coming up. So I'll talk a little, so for those of you who really want to know more about arroyo dams, you're going to hear more about that if you come to that. Those are in terrible condition. And those pose real risks to flash flooding in like small desert communities or even larger desert communities like El Paso and Juarez. I think another part of your question that I think is fascinating, there's a stretch of about 150 miles between El Paso and Juarez that was straightened in the 1930s. They cut out about, I want to say 80 miles. You'd have to double check in the book, can't remember. But they cut out all the bends in the river and straightened it. They did that to a lot of rivers. They did it to the Chicago River. They did it to parts of the Mississippi, Napa River, Kissimmee River in Florida. And there is now a movement, various environmental movements to remove smaller dams, to actually rebend rivers and rewild them. And the fact that the river has to do double duty as both a river and a purportedly rigid, immovable international divide means that the prospect for rebending the Rio Grande is not on the horizon. And so that's another way I think it is interesting to think about a comparative environmental analysis, kind of going back to Michael's question of like, so what is different about the border and other places? And you can ask that from an engineering point of view, you can ask it from a policing point of view, you can ask it from an environmentalist point of view as well.
CJ, I'm gonna be greedy here and ask another question. I had to, you've emphasized the cooperative side of Mexican-American relations, and you showed the example of a dam. But how are disputes mediated if you're building a dam with Mexican engineers on one side? I don't want to bring up the possible disputes, but I assume there are disputes from time to time. How are those mediated?
So it's so interesting. So unlike all other, except now the BLM, Bureau of Land Management, right? Not Black Lives Matter. The BLM recently changed its headquarters, and that's a whole can of worms that Westerners, worry about. But if you have a federal agency in Mexico or in the United States, it's in Washington, D.C., right? The head of all the major agencies are in the capitals, except the Boundary and Water Commission. The headquarters of the International Boundary and Water Commission for the U.S. side is in El Paso, Texas, right where it should be. And the headquarters of the SILA, the Comisión Internacional de Aguas y Límites, or Límites y Aguas, the Mexican counterpart to that, is in Ciudad Juárez, like literally walking distance away. And so there is a physical connection that the commissioners have and that their employees have that kind of force them to get along, because you have to see people face to face. If you go to Amistad Dam, for instance, if you look in the center of the construction, there's like this skybox looking thing, kind of like the Matthew McConaughey like Longhorn Stadium box, that he sits in for the football games. And it's a meeting room for the two for delegates from both agencies. So neither of them have to deal with customs, even though they all could. They all have diplomatic status. So they can meet on top of the dam with this great view of the reservoir, and they can dispense with the rancor and the hostility that comes, I think, with distance, because they're forced to connect and they're forced to get along in specific environments. And I was skeptical about the way in the archives and in the oral histories, the leaders of these organizations just sang like love songs to each other, and because it was so contradictory to the way we're taught to think about the U.S.-Mexico border as a site of of conflict. And then I met at a water conference out in Marfa before the pandemic, one of the chief biologists, this Mexican American dude from El Paso, has been with the IBWC for a really long time, and I got to know the historian for the IBWC, and I asked him, like, so are you guys really, like, is it really as seamless as I'm led to believe? You know, the Texas Observer and Quartz did a brilliant, I think what I would say 8-part series a few years ago about border water, and they made the same argument that, yeah, you know, the water commissioners are, you know, they tend to get along pretty well. And as far as I can tell, I'm sure there's some bad blood somewhere, but compared to, you know, the SRE in Mexico and the go to the embassy level attaché people working for the military, working for the DEA, working for the border patrol, you don't find that same kind of conflict. And if you look back to the 19th century, you find that the origin of the boundary commissions was not as construction agencies, but were as arbitration agencies for these minor land disputes between Texas and the United States. So they're built in the model of mitigation and arbitration, not of big political posturing and confrontation.
Interesting. Thank you. We have a question, I think, from Elena. Elena, would you like to ask it?
Sure. Hi, CJ.
Hey, what's up?
I think it's a pretty basic question. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, you mentioned the oral histories you were working with at UTEP. And like, just because I work with oral histories, I was wondering if you would talk a little bit about like whose oral histories, were there agencies, were there like everyday people, like the oral histories that you used and how they worked, how they played into your work?
So the students out there, for those of you who don't know, the Oral History Institute out at our brilliant partner UTEP in El Paso is just second to none. And I say that, I mean, look, we know we got Maggie's here and we got Voces, and she's done just astonishing work, you know, for a really long time. The UTEP Oral History Collection started, I want to say the 1970s with Oscar Martinez and some other people. And so they were able to get these old timers from the 70s who were like talking about what it was like during the Mexican Revolution. I mean, they were able to reach really deeply back into history. And they did a really brilliant job in terms of like blocking up oral history participants to everyone from like Spanish language only, just working people on the Mexican side, all the way up to like the commissioner of the IBWC, you know, on the American side. And the beauty of this collection is it's all word searchable. It's all populated PDF documents. It's all word searchable. And there's thousands and thousands and thousands of them. And so it is not only a massive, really, really excellent archive, it is also really easy to use as a researcher. Remotely too, people, I know that some of my students who are in the room also, I think I've been pointing them to that in the context of the pandemic as a great digital workaround to get into historical documents that are not, when we can't get into the actual physical archives. So check it out.
Thank you so much, CJ. I think we will, the time has come to bring this to an end unless someone has a quick question. I really appreciate your sharing your book with us and helping us, even people who don't really have a stake in this field, to think about borders in a more imaginative way. And I really want to thank you for that and for taking the time to be with us today.
Oh, the pleasure is all mine. It was a real honor. Thanks for having me.
Okay, hope to see you all at future events of the Institute.